great poet Virgil, who was inspired by the Muses, narrated the story of the most well-known Trojan warrior, whose fame and splendor were only surpassed by the great Hector, Prince of Troy, at the request of the Roman Emperor Octavian Augustus. Aeneas was the name of this hero, and his accomplishments would be remembered for thousands of years. Aeneas was given command of the Trojan armies that had been battling the Greeks for 10 years in front of the Trojan wall after Hector was killed by Achilles. However, the gods finally seemed to favor the Trojans when the Greeks set sail from their shores after failing to breach the sacred walls of Troy. They only left a huge wooden horse to the gods as a sacrifice. A huge celebration was held to honor the great Trojan triumph over the invading army, which ended a decade of fighting, and the magnificent horse was brought into Troy itself as a trophy. The bravest on heroes appeared from the wooden horse's belly during the stillness of the night, and protected by the darkness, they ambushed and startled the little garrison guarding the Trojan gates. Following the opening of the gates, hundreds of Greek warriors who had been hiding inside the city began to occupy and destroy Troy. The streets of Troy saw a bloodbath unlike any other, with women, children, and the old being slain with swords, and shown no mercy. As the Greeks captured the city, Aeneas was soundly asleep in his room. However, the ghost of the magnificent Prince Hector visited him in his dreams. Aeneas was told to wake up by Priam's lovely son because Troy had been invaded. Hector advised him to take the holy artifacts of Troy with him and choose a new city with strong walls to safeguard them, saying that it was his duty to preserve the priceless Trojan culture. As the city he had fought for years burned to the ground in front of his eyes, Aeneas was horrified. It was now a place doomed. After donning his armor, Aeneas set out to combat the Achons, ravaging the magnificent city. For a while, he and his men put up a fierce fight against the Greeks, keeping them from moving forward. But the wave of invaders was too great for so few men to halt. When Aeneas realized that Troy was doomed, he withdrew, rushing to retrieve his wife, Primusa, and his son, Ascanius, with whom he ran to save his elderly father. Aeneas attempted to persuade his father to accompany him in leaving Troy in order to fulfill his destiny of preserving Trojan customs and culture after he met the elderly and disabled Anchises. However, his father had no plans to abandon his cherished nation and spend his final days in exile. At that moment, a tiny flame appeared above Ascanius' head, indicating a clear divine sign. Aeneas recognized that his family's responsibility was to preserve all of their predecessors' memories. There was chaos in the streets of Troy, and Aeneas tried to guide his family to the meeting place agreed upon with the other men who were attempting to escape Troy. He gave in to his son's wishes and chose to follow him everywhere he went. Aeneas had to carry his crippled father on his back after he was struck down by a thunderbolt from Jupiter for his pride. The hero and his wife were separated at that very moment by a terrified mob. Aeneas would not see his wife alive again after this. Aeneas made it to one of the secondary gates that would have allowed him to leave Troy. But he was devastated to discover that his wife had fallen behind him and made the decision to return and look for her. At that moment, Cusa's soul materialized and informed Aeneas that she was already dead, and that it was not her destiny to accompany them. She urged him to keep moving forward on his path, where Aeneas would discover grandeur and glory, and to stop searching for her. Ascanius sobbed in his father's arms, pleading for his mother to come back, but there was nothing he could do. At the base of Mount Ida, Aeneas had to assemble the remaining Trojans and create a fresh strategy for their future. Upon the reunion of Aeneas, his family, and the remaining Trojans, Aeneas reminded everyone of the old prophecy that Sidonius would inherit the Trojan tradition, and that he would establish a new city where the descendants of Troy would proliferate and conquer numerous territories. In pursuit of the destiny that the gods had foretold, Aeneas would guide his people into the unknown. There would be many trials and adventures along this route. One of the most epic trips in history begins as Aeneas, and the Trojans set off in search of a fresh start. The Aeneid, the foundation narrative of a society that would make history because of the magnificence of its music people, begins here. Aeneas led a group of refugees after Troy fell in quest of a new territory, where a prophecy that he and his descendants would discover a second Troy that would surpass its predecessor in magnificence and majesty would come true. He made the decision to construct an altar for them as soon as they set foot on the Thrace shoreline, gather offerings, and offer them as a sacrifice to the gods. Aeneas was shocked to discover blood trickling from the stems of the wild flowers he had gathered to decorate the god's altar, and he was terrified he was invading a dryad's garden. But the reality was even more depressing. A young Trojan prince who lived in Thrace before being kidnapped by Ajax of Salamis and transported to Troy, where he was stoned outside the Trojan gates, was confronted by the spirit of Polydorus. His soul went back to Thrace to rest in the final location where he had found happiness. Since the Thracian monarch was no longer a Trojan friend, the boy's ghost begged Aeneas to leave the area because staying there would only lead to ruin. Aeneas performed a ceremony in honor of the prince whose life had been cut so short before departing Thrace. Like the goddess Leo, who roamed for a long time looking for a home that would accept her children, the Trojan survivors, who faced foes on nearly every side, were uncertain if there was any land that would welcome them. Their homeland is Phoebe's Apollo and Diana. They made their way to the holy island of Deus. The king of Delos, who served as the chief priest of Apollo's temple, welcomed Aeneas and his father there as they sought answers from the oracle of Apollo. After hearing the oracle's declaration that they would need to travel to the land of their distant ancestors, Aeneas and his father departed Delos. Aeneas noted that since their ancestors had set out to found the city of Troy from the island of Crete, they would need to travel there. It seemed as though they had discovered the promised land when they established the city of Pergamon among the Crete. Although they constructed palaces and shrines there, their actual destiny was not to reside on the island where the legendary Jupiter had been born. Crops were damaged by a horrible drought, and the Trojans started to get sick. During these terrifying days on the island of Crete, many of them perished. The people looked to their leaders for guidance, but Aeneas was unable to resolve their predicament. He gave them instructions to prepare, since they would be returning to the island of Delos to find the solution. However, the Trojan gods visited Aeneas that same night while he was asleep, including Teucer, the progenitor who created the Trojan lineage. The guests informed Aeneas that they were not permitted on Jupiter's hallowed grounds, since the great deity was aware of Juno's intense hatred of the Trojans, and that her animosity would bring bad luck to all Cree peoples. The divine beings told him that the Trojans had arrived in the wrong ancestors' homeland, Hesperia, and that the glorious Dardanelles, one of Troy's founding fathers, had left from there. The following day, Aeneas told everyone to prepare, since the gods had come to visit him, and they would alter their plan. Aeneas was tasked with guiding his fleet toward what is now Italy, the ancient Hesperia. However, 3 days of intense storms covered the seas, and without the stars to guide them, their helmsman Palinurus appeared unsure of their destination. Nevertheless, the Trojans found a safe harbor to disembark on the island of Stros, unaware that it was home to cursed creatures. Aeneas and the Trojans were once again on the high seas, headed for the land that had been promised to them. As they soon discovered wild goats to eat, Aeneas's men anticipated the area would be hospitable. However, before they could indulge in goat meat, they offered a sacrifice to Jupiter, who had delivered the pleasant region into their path. However, he was unaware that the great god was refraining from helping the Trojans because of concern for his wife Juno's wrath, who was the Trojans' nemesis. At that moment, one of Asia's soldiers sounded the alarm because 3 monstrous winged monsters were drawing near. These were the vile harpies, half-bird, half-woman creatures who had settled on the island of Stroys after being vanquished by the Argonauts. They were dirty creatures, and their decay tainted everything. Once more, Aeneas's people had to hunt and prepare goat meat, but the harpies returned and ruined the Trojans' dinner. Aeneas decided to hide his weapons in the brush and wait for the harpies. Aeneas and his troops prepared to battle the harpies when they returned. Before they left, one of the harpies even cursed them for killing their cattle, telling them that they would have to suffer, starve, and eat their own tables before they could settle in the land that the gods had promised them. The battle was fierce, and both sides fought valiantly, but Aeneas's men were not nearly as strong and resilient as the brave children of the gods who accompanied Jason. Now that Aeneas' fleet was in Italian waters, all indications pointed to them approaching their eagerly anticipated destination. However, they encountered the dangerous Charybdis, a massive underwater creature that ingested the seawater and formed a massive vortex that engulfed anything nearby. In order to go as far away from the massive vortex as possible, Aeneas's ships managed to squeeze through the rock walls. Fortunately, They chose the side opposite the monster Scylla's cave, where the ships were ambushed as they approached it. After successfully avoiding such peril, they made their way to the Sicilian coast, where they came across the massive Mount Etna, a powerful volcano that erupted lava and flames. The tales state that the monster Typhon was imprisoned beneath the volcano when Zeus threw a massive mountain upon it, and the explosions revealed that the monster was furious. Once more, Aeneas and his father touched down in uncharted territory. However, bold Anchises were starting to exhibit symptoms that the taxing travel was taking a toll on him and that his health was deteriorating daily. He was one of Odysseus's men, king of Ithaca, who had fought against the Trojans in the Trojan War. He knelt before Aeneas and begged for forgiveness and assistance, telling them that he had been left behind on the island of the Cyclops when Odysseus passed by. He had failed to join Odysseus when he escaped from the Cyclops Polyphemus because he was ill and wounded, and had been hiding from the awful Cyclops that had inhabited the island ever since. The Trojans were surprised by a visitor in the middle of the night who was sweating in rags. The enormous one-eyed monster then appeared, but fortunately for the Trojans, Odysseus had blinded it, so it was unaware of his men's presence. Aeneas and his team were able to minimize their noise level in order to avoid drawing the Cyclops' notice, and started their vessels carrying the Greek amended. But when they departed once more, Aeneas saw that his father was dying. The great Dardanian lord was stepping down from his position as preserving his people's heritage in his son's care, and thus he passed away elderly, and Aeneas planned a funeral for Jesus, the man who was once even adored by the goddess of love. As a tribute to the great ruler of the Danaans, Aeneas and his son Aeneas were finally the sole surviving members of the once dominant Trojan royal family. And magnificent finally, Aeneas and his troops were approaching the land that the gods had promised them. But one of them had not given them that gift. Assures the Trojans she was Juno, who the Greeks called Hera, the spouse of the ultimate deity, remained fiercely antagonistic toward the Trojans, and not even the goddess's fury could be placated by completely destroying their magnificent metropolis. With several trials still to come, Juno ordered the wind gods to attack Aeneas and the Trojans, the Trojan vessels, and shake the oceans with their explosions. The formerly, the calm sea, appeared to have rebelled against the Trojans, as the ship's sails were torn by the strong gusts, and the massive waves threatened to overturn the vessels and send their crews into the ocean. Juno's interference in his spheres of influence infuriated Neptune, the god of the seas. Without consulting the realm's ultimate lord, the powerful god frightened the wind and threw the waters into chaos. Using his trident, the gods calmed the sea waters, sparing Aeneas from a terrible fate in Juno's pandemonium. A number of ships vanished, but Aeneas, when the majority of his ships made it to the coast of North Africa, They had no idea that they had arrived at the Libyan kingdom, a territory ruled by immigrants from the island of Phoenicia. Using his bow and arrow, Aeneas slew 6 deer-like creatures of the indigenous wildlife and was able to feed his people, who were starving on Venus. In the gods' dwelling, Aeneas' mother and the goddess of love knelt before Jupiter and inquired about her sons. Done to merit such a severe penalty, the Almighty God promised her that she had nothing to be concerned about despite his wife Juno's rage. He would assure Aeneas that all of his prophecies would come to pass in Italy, establish the groundwork for a country that would surpass all others. Octavius Augustus and Julius Caesar would emerge with their names. These individuals distinguish out from everyone else of their era, resonating over time, much like Hela's, Mercury's great heroes. At Jupiter's direction, the quick messenger god set out for Carthage to inform them about Aeneas and his. It was the responsibility of the Carthaginians to provide a cordial welcome to their guests. Aeneas was on one of his hunts when he happened onto the most stunning woman he had ever laid eyes on, wearing a huntress's outfit and exuding a sense of divinity. He welcomed her with the highest regard despite not being the goddess of hunting Diana. Her hair was. He was correct, she was his mother, and she could only be a deity as dark as night. Pretending to be a huntress from Libya, she informed him of his whereabouts and the residence. Most significantly, she informed him about Dido, the Libyan queen who ruled the country from her. The Phoenician king's daughter, the beautiful Queen Dido, ruled Carthage, but when her brother seized the throne of Tyre and killed her husband in order to deprive her of all her riches, Dido then fled north and made her way to North Africa, bringing all of her husband's enormous fortune with her to keep her vicious brother Dido from stealing it. Went on to colonize these far-off places, and with the goddess Juno's help, expanded what had been a tiny. It is supposed that Juno intended for Carthage to be transformed from a little village into a splendid city, the cornerstone of a global empire. Following the huntress's explanation regarding the queen, Aeneas informed him that based on the bird's flight, one could assume that Aeneas would be in for a pleasant surprise when he returned to his base, because a number of swans were returning by air. As the huntress turned to depart, united after being scattered by an eagle, her hair had a delightful, distinct perfume that Aeneas could detect. This was his divine mother scent, so he knew she was still keeping an eye on him. The gods appeared to be on his side when Aeneas returned to his people and saw many ships on the horizon that had vanished. Aeneas would now have to heed his mother's counsel and return home. Carthage, Queen Dido, Aeneas, and a few warriors on their way to the city of Carthage, bringing presents for Queen Dido, who dominated the entire area. When the Trojan leader and queen first laid eyes on one another, They were both astounded by how beautiful Dato was. Venus and the handsome Aeschylus were the parents of the lovely Aeneas, whose physique and the goddess Venus watched over everything, and her looks were particularly seductive. Concerned about the destiny of her beloved son, because Carthage was a Trojan enemy and was patronized by the goddess Juno, requested assistance from her second son Cupid, the god of desire, who was to pose as Aeneas' son, causing Aeneas and Dato had a lot in common, and it was certain that the queen fell in love with his half-brother. Both were widows of lovers who had been brutally killed and were descended from important royal families, ended up in exile with the goal of creating a magnificent society. Although Carthage was expanding quickly, Aeneas was quite delighted to introduce his son to the future metropolis, which was only a distant dream. Cupid, in disguise, grabbed the boy when Aeneas told the queen Dato how much she loved him and requested him to embrace him, chanced to use one of his golden arrows to pierce the queen of Carthage, igniting her intense yearning for Aeneas. The queen couldn't stop thinking about the attractive host from faraway places during the night, but she had promised not to date anybody else after her spouse passed away. The next day, Dato welcomed, even though the queen appeared frail. Aeneas was a skilled hunter, archer, and amazed Aeneas with her precision. But the intense rain caused the two to take cover from the storm, and they did so in a nearby cave. Out of sight, Queen Dato announced her. Eventually, Aeneas's love for the Trojan prince gave way to the allure of that stunning woman. Dato began cultivating a covert romance, but the goddess Juno's watchful eye was not spared, went to Venus and proposed ending the conflict between her and the love goddess. Sun as a means of. In order to finalize this agreement, she suggested that Aeneas and Dato, her protege, work together in a strong coalition. But Venus was dubious because Juno wasn't known for being understanding. Aeneas and Dato started living together as Dato ruled over Aeneas, helped her oversee her partner's kingdom. But the disgraceful goddess's notoriety sparked gossip about the pair's union across Libya. The rumors got to King Arbus, who had turned Dato down because she would. He had constructed multiple temples to Jupiter and was aware that the god owed him a debt of. With appreciation, he invoked the Almighty to expel Aeneas from those territories. Mercury, at Jupiter's request, the messenger god traveled to deliver the Olympian lord's word. He gave Aeneas instructions too. He had to leave Carthage as soon as possible because his home was in Italy. Aeneas loved living with Dato in the land that the gods had promised him. But he, the Trojan leader, aware of his responsibility to create a new empire for his son and people, ordered his warriors to avoid raising suspicions. They made careful preparations for their departure. But Dato was not a fool and saw the peculiar events and confronted Aeneas, the queen felt deceived by him, who intended to flee in hiding after being accepted by her, and pretended to be her spouse. But Aeneas was not, influenced by Dato's remarks, as he had already decided to depart for Italy. Aeneas, Dato ordered a great pie to help his troops continue their preparations, leaving the devastated queen behind, be constructed as she prepared to carry out a ceremony that would help her move past her love for the cunning Trojan. On a platform, Dato then threw everything she had given Aeneas into the fire. To her surprise, the queen cursed the Trojans and aimed the sword that had belonged to Aeneas at her stomach. He said that it was the responsibility of the Carthaginian people to be enduring adversaries of those derived from the Trojans. Dato threw herself into the flaming flames in front of the Carthaginian people, mortally wounding herself with the sword. Never forgot this terrifying scene where Aeneas and his fleet even saw the enormous. Aeneas was now lighting up the night and listening to the Carthaginian people's cries of turmoil, returning to Italy. Yet his carelessness still cost him dearly in the form of calamities. Music activities after a long trip away from Carthage. Aeneas and his people were on the island of Sicily once more, approaching their ultimate destination. This time they would find a friendly village where Acestes, a king and the son of a Trojan noblewoman. Because of this, the Trojans were welcomed in various countries. However, Juno saw that Aeneas was about to carry out his destiny, sent the goddess Iris to corrupt the old and Trojans' minds, who were unable to endure the agony they had endured while at sea for so long. Before Aeneas knew it, the elderly and ladies had set fire to a significant number of Aeneas's ships as they pleased. To remain in the realm of Assus, the Trojan leader frantically gazed at his. Jupiter would not permit the elders to burn all the finest ships menacing them with his thunder and lightning. That evening, Aeneas received a visit from his father's ghost. When old Aeneas informed his son of Jupiter's directives, he gave Aeneas instructions to assemble the most resilient fighters and the healthiest, youngest women so they can board the remaining ships and at last gather new provisions and arrive at the land the gods had given them, leaving behind the elderly and ill as well as the women who did not wish to continue. Aeneas set out with his selected men. After the monarch who had welcomed them, those who remained would discover a village called Aesta. Aeneas's journey to Italy was smooth as Jupiter had grown tired of Juno's meddling and had ordered her to cease interfering with the Trojans remaining. Additionally, he requested that Neptune calm the seas so that Aeneas could sail more easily, and his waning fleet arrived in Italy close to the Tiber River's mouth. The Latins called this area Latium, dwelt there. After arriving on shore, the Trojan began preparing big flat wheat loaves. The little Aeneas added, "We are eating our own food," as they utilized them as a table to serve other food. Tables, the Harpies' curse, according to which they would suffer until they consumed their own tables, was recalled by the Aeneas. Aeneas realized that the Trojans would settle here as the gods had decreed, and these were the blessed areas where they would establish a settlement as the foundation of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. The palace was visible not far from the camp that Aeneas and his people had established. Latinus ruled over the Italic people who resided in the area. An ancient and astute ruler, the great-grandson of the god Saturn and descended from Faunes, although King Latinus had only one child, the beautiful, and no male successors. All of Latium Turnus's unmarried nobles were courting Princess Lavinia. Among the princess's numerous suitors, he was a strong, attractive, and influential warrior son of the Rachel king. But according to a prophecy, Lavinia would wed a foreign prince with divine ancestry. This foreigner and his family would establish the most powerful empire in history and govern the entire planet. This prophecy meant that Latinus refused to let his daughter get married in the hopes that the God-sent husband would eventually. Turnus was angry about this circumstance, since he believed that there was. After the death of the previous king, he was the only one qualified to govern the Latin people. At this point, Aeneas's envoys invaded the Latin city in an attempt to show hospitality. At first, the townspeople viewed them with distrust, but the king greeted them with as Jupiter ordered, the greatest hospitality was shown to Aeneas's party. The king described all of their misadventures and disappointments till they eventually arrived at the Italian peninsula and arrived in the location that the gods had decreed for them to be. The king listened to the foreigners and was certain that Latinus declared that the man the Phoebus oracle had predicted was the Trojan leader, said their people needed to marry together, and that Aeneas and his men were more than welcome in the country, and he would propose to Aeneas his beloved daughter, creating an unbreakable tie between the two peoples. And in order to carry out God's will, he introduced the Trojans with magnificent horses and delivered a divinely drawn chariot as a gift to Aeneas. Gift the Trojans went to deliver the joyful news to their leader. But Juno was furious at observing that Aeneas and the Trojans appeared to be having a fantastic fate in front of them. But if this were their fate, they wouldn't succeed. Alto, the most vicious of the gods, was dispatched by the queen with little difficulty. She was told to sow hatred, resentment, and the desire for war by the Furies in people's hearts all throughout the area. The terrifying rage then moved on to found the queen in the Latin palace crying because she was unable to accept her. Alto took advantage of her husband's decision to give her cherished daughter's hand in marriage to a foreigner. wrapped the queen's neck with one of the snakes that the rage carried in her hair. The snake transformed into an. The queen went out into the streets due to the captivating golden necklace and its sway, hatting strangers and using derogatory language against the Trojans always has a nice ring to people who are unhappy with them. After finishing the initial phase of Mission Alto flew to the home of Turnus, a formidable warrior who was resting, and the rage lit Turnus' heart with war using a fiery torch. Aeneas and the Trojans were prevented from succeeding by the cruel prince's desire. Turnus ordered his warriors to get ready for the kingdom he believed should be his. For combat, since they would depart for fight, and only take a break until the final drop of the Latium grounds had been nurtured by Trojan blood, and there was a magnificent deer in the Latium is the most beautiful location, and it appeared to have formed a bond with Sylvia, the little daughter of the aristocrat in charge of the shepherds in the area. The deer seemed unconcerned about. When the Latins saw such a thing, they gladly accepted her patting it. Seen, they thought that such a sign could only indicate their friendship and divine blessing, indications of such an animal. Upon observing this, Juno directed the beautiful beast toward Aeneas' son, Aeneas, who was already shown exceptional hunting skills, was amazed by the Aeneas shot the deer, and he longed to acquire a trophy like that. After fatally injuring it, he and a few hunters pursued the deer as it ran away in the direction of his friend Sylvia's home in Asanio, discovered the deer in pain, with Sylvia sobbing next to it. She urged the local shepherds to exact revenge on the death of the sacred deer. They intended to murder the Trojans and Aeneas, but they had no notion that they were engaged in combat with seasoned combatants who had been honed by blood and iron on the battlefields of the Trojan War. Word spread about the vengeful shepherds and the murder of the sacred deer. Hatred of the Trojan foreigners spread like wildfire over Latium. The Latins, there was going to be a big war. The desire for bloodshed grew throughout the Latino community. When the ugly rage poured her venom into their hearts, Latium Turnus gathered all of the irate individuals at the Latin king's palace gates and demanded that he make war on the foreign Trojans that Latinus had intended to flee this realm in peace. But with the help of Queen Turnus, he was able to win over everyone who was welcoming to Latinos. The king feared that the gods would prevent him from passing away in peace, as he so much desired for Camilla, the warrior. From the violin, a princess who had studied the art of combat while escorting the goddess Artemis's entourage kingdom, she came to support Turnus, one of her people's allies, to signal that the Latins were at war. The king was commanded to open the magnificent gates of the Janus temple. However, the emperor disobeyed the order and withdrew to his apartments, refusing to show the goddess Juno any more tolerance. He hurried to the ground and used her own hands to open the temple gates. The fighters were ecstatic to discover that the goddess was on their side, and they were persuaded that in the Ilon regions, Juno had assisted the Greeks in defeating the Trojans, would give them yet another crushing defeat. While they were standing on the banks of the Tiber Aeneas River, pondered the unthinkable hardship that the Trojans would have to go through despite the fact that they were exceptional warriors. The united troops of the Latium cities, then Tiber, were too strong for the few Trojans. When the river deity surfaced from the water, he assured Aeneas that there was no need to give up. With the exception of Juno, the gods were on his side. He declared that Aeneas had to travel to the under a Pelasgian monarch from Greece, controlled the kingdom of Tuscany, while being the Greek settlers were Trojan allies, and Aeneas visited King Onder for convinced the Tuscans to assist the Latins because they were also their foes. An elderly man claimed he would not be able to defeat the Trojans, who were not yet a formidable king, battle, but would send his son Pallas and his finest knights to guide his troops on behalf of the monarch. Somewhere in the heavenly forges of Mount Etna Vulcan, at the request of his wife Venus, the forging god was creating magnificent weapons for Aeneas that could only be compared to. Venus gave them to her loving son, saying that as long as he wore them, they would be similar to the ones Achilles himself used. He would be able to repel any adversary with them. The hero felt that he would be nearly unbeatable on the battlefield with those weapons and armor. But one thing hit him more than the others: his new shield, which included a number of high-relief pieces that showed the future of Rome. However, found these pictures to be perplexing. They included the twins and the shepherd men holding ladies in their arms, along with numerous other tales that inspired. Tourneys made no sense at all to the Trojan when Aeneas was searching for allies. When given a celestial visit, Iris, the god's messenger, conveyed a message. According to Juno and the legendary warrior, the Trojan camp on the banks of the Tiber was in danger without Aeneas. Turn led his force there, unprotected, but the dust created by his armies notified the Trojan watchmen, who raised the alarm. The Roman chief challenged the Trojans to confront them. However, Aeneas's troops were not stupid and refused to submit to tourneys. Taunts before confronting the Latium warriors, they would wait for Aeneas to return. Tourneys tossed his asagi at the Trojan palisade guards, but the Trojans had little choice but to hide behind their trenches and walls. Tourneys gave the command to siege the Trojan camp until additional warriors could be gathered for the last attack, but Tourneys became agitated and paced back and forth in an attempt to find a method too. He then assembled his finest warriors and started out to attack the Trojans, carrying lanterns in the direction of the exposed Trojan vessels on the riverbed. Sibyl, the mother of the Olympian gods, refused to permit the burning of Aeneas's holy vessels. She turned to Jupiter, her son, and begged him to keep the wooden boats from her sacred grove from becoming destroyed when Turnus and his men threw the goddess whole forest as a sacrifice. Aeneas was able to have his fleet. Expecting the boats to burn rapidly, they aimed their torches at the ships. Turnus' sailors were astonished to learn that Jupiter had given the ships life and transformed them into wonderful marine animals, only serve as evidence that the gods supported the Trojans. But Turnus accepted the sign. In contrast, he believed that the disappearance of the Trojan ships signified that this time Juno would prevent them from running away after losing, and they would be completely exterminated. The Rachel and Commander Turnus made a valiant advance in the hopes of ending the Trojan camp, attacked the shielded enemy fortifications, and made an attempt to overrun the Trojan defenses. Although there weren't many Trojans at the time, their soldiers had fought for 10 years against the Greek invaders on the Trojan wall and were used to fending off enemy forces' attacks. But when Turnus successfully set fire to one of the defense towers and caused its collapse, the Trojans became alarmed. Unavoidably, Turnus and his soldiers rushed the Trojan camp by taking advantage of the opening the tower had provided. The Romans' breakthrough was not halted by the Trojans' resistance, because their defenses continued to obstruct more. Turnus slew multiple Trojans with his sword to prevent opponents from advancing from other parts of the wall. He experienced the same sense of power that Achilles would have had he invaded Troy. But the youthful Aeneas refused to let the enemy defeat his father's warriors, and he killed Turnus by shooting Romulus in the head. Emboldened, Aeneas longed for his brother-in-law and launched the Trojan counterattack to leap forward and use his spear to kill the enemy commander. But a hand on his shoulder prevented him from doing so. Phoebus Apollo, the deity, advised him to be satisfied with defeating just one great hero that day, since, if he persisted, he would only face definite death if he fought on the front lines. Aeneas recalled the colleague Patroclus' Achilles, soldier who ignored the counsel of his companion and met his demise directly at the spear of the magnificent Hector, the youthful. The Dardanelles prince chose to stay at the back and allow the more seasoned. Turnus was seemingly unstoppable and only paused his momentum to engage in combat with the intruders. The battle was fiercely contested, but the brave Trojan named ultimately died after being hit by Turnus, who was engaged in combat with Juno's approval. Although his death was not for nothing, as the rest of Ilion concentrated on battling the Trojan hero, the remaining attackers were chased away by soldiers who fled for their lives. If Turnus had only concentrated on unlocking the gateways for his soldiers rather than seeking fame by taking on champions, that day victory would have undoubtedly been achieved. But the Trojans were now encircling As the Trojans threw arrows, Turnus desperately ran to save his own life, threw spears at him. But the invisible god Juno was fortunate enough to deflect the attacks. Turnus jumped into the Tiber River after racing to the back of the Trojan camp. Trojans thought that he would drown in such a desperate act, but luckily for the warrior, the god residing in the river was the Ruli's friend, so he would prevent the warrior from sinking beneath the weight of his shield and armor in the Venus, the god's home planet, bemoaned to Jupiter that Juno was unbalanced the conflict by. Jupiter then ruled that aiding the indigenous peoples would split the gods, as it had done at Troy, and that the deities would no longer play a major role in the war, and the warriors themselves would have to reveal the destiny the Mora had in store for them as he came out of the water after nearly drowning. Turnus noticed that Aeneas was returning over the Tiber with troops from nearby kingdoms that had joined forces with the hero of the Dardanelle to combat the Aeneas and Virgil were to demonstrate to his adversaries the real cost of war by arousing Mars, the god of war, to rage and desire blood. Aeneas has finally arrived after being away from his comrades for a few days, returning with a sizable army of troops from several areas who sought retribution against their Rachel and Latin adversaries. But at the outset of the conflict, Prince Turnus Hara killed the palace son of the king. Once he realized that the counterattack by Trojans and their allies would be disastrous if they were removed from the action with the knowledge that the valiant warrior would face his adversaries head-on and would undoubtedly perish. Aeneas successfully defended his camp's defenses while leading his soldiers in the front line. In the opposing side, the noble, in order to keep his allies united, Etruscan Mezantes made sure they weren't. Mezantius was knocked down by an assagi thrown by the Trojans after they breached. When Aeneas saw his injured father retreat to the back, the young fighter, in a fit of rage, Lausus attacked Aeneas, who repelled his blows and even issued a warning to retreat. If he continued, he would encounter no pity, but the young desired more than anything to exact revenge on his father, and ultimately shortened his own life as a result. When he saw his, Mezentius lamented his terrible fate as his son's body was returned from the front lines. He felt that his life had no purpose, so he mounted his horse and went on a suicidal rampage toward the Trojan lines. He looked. Aeneas was his intended victim, but he defended himself against Mezantius's assault by utilizing the Trojan hero launched a spear from his celestial shield, wounding the mount of the defender of the Etruscans. The animal's body fell on top of Mezantius, crushing him as he pleaded with Aeneas, while suffering from the weight of his own mount. Aeneas consented to his request to return his body to his subjects for a dignified funeral. The Trojans declared victory that day after making the request and giving him the Cudigra. They honored Mars, the god of war, who at the time supported the Latin envoys, sought a meeting with Aeneas and a ceasefire so that the corpses of the fallen may be gathered and delivered to their. Aeneas, one of the relatives, said he was merely protecting himself and did not want to continue fighting. Retelling and Latins, who had turned down the union that the Latin monarch himself had suggested if they wished to stay out of they would have tourneys fight him in a one-time duel, resulting in the needless deaths of thousands. The ceasefire was agreed upon, and the Latin envoys departed with a favorable impression of. Another party of Latin envoys realized that the Trojan prince was a kind man who didn't want to shed blood in vain, were present in the court of the well-known Greek monarch Diomedes, one of the most well-known Trojan war heroes who is still alive today. The Italian peninsula, the combat veteran was asked to assist the Latins against the Trojans, but he promptly declined when he found out that they would be his opponents, according to Dames, had previously vanquished them in Troy. But Agamemnon's victory merely brought bad luck to the Ilon foes. Ulysses and Menos had been lost at sea while attempting to return home, and the Locrian had been killed upon his return. The gods had drowned the warrior Ajax, and he had lost his throne. The Argus hero informed him that the presents that were delivered to him should be given to Aeneas as a vow of peace in return for his allegiance once the gods had rewarded him, and anyone who opposed him would only be killed when the two arrived. The Latin People's Council met with groups of emissaries. Both emissaries reported the results of their missions, and peace between the Latins and the Trojans seemed to be the best course of action for the majority of people in attendance. The Latin monarch who had urged that the two peoples form an alliance by marrying Aeneas to the Latin, as they had not sought conflict from the beginning. Additionally, the affluent nobleman Dances consented to plant a substantial portion of his territory to the Trojans in return for peace. But as the gathering was still, the sentries on the Latin walls shouted that Aeneas was close to the gates as they discussed the issue. In anticipation of tourneys, the Trojan army assembled in front of the walls of the Latin citadel to step up and engage Aeneas in a one-time duel that would end the altercation tourneys and the Latin. Aeneas was waiting for the nobility and his troops when they left the fortress. As the sacrifices to the Aeneas appeared tall and self-assured, and the contrast between the two fighters' stances was remarkable. Turnus looked glum and pallid, but his sister, the nymph Juno Turnus, persuaded. Enchanted by the goddess Juno, she crept into the Latin soldiers' ranks and informed the warriors not to place all the blame for the destiny of the city on Turnus, and that they were more numerous and could prevail in the conflict. Encouraged by the nymph Turnus' troops, broke the armistice by launching spears and arrows upon the Trojans and their Etruscan allies. A significant fight began. Aeneas made a fruitless attempt to halt the fighting and carry on with the combat. However, the fighters' blood was gushing, and they were only able to concentrate on their adversaries up ahead. At that moment, bloodshed started when an unidentified warrior shot Aeneas with an arrow. He was transported to the back for medical treatment as Terran, the Etruscan king, assumed leadership. The conflict was evenly balanced when Queen Camilla and her troops outflanked the Trojans and their allies. With her personal guard of Camilla used her bow to blast the Trojans, killing Amazon soldiers in the process. The hunting goddess Diana gave her a bow, and she proceeded to defeat Trojan after Trojan. Her survival was not predetermined. However, the Etruscan warrior Aeneas used a javelin to knock Camilla down during the combat. But the goddess, the Etruscan, was shot with multiple arrows because Diana would not allow the murderer of her devoted companion to escape punishment. Another goddess in the backdrop, from Camilla's soldiers who exacted revenge on their lady, was influencing the war's outcome. Venus saw her darling son suffering from. In order to heal Aeneas's wound, divine ambrosia was poured into it. When the doctor applied the treatment, he was shocked to see how rapidly the incision stopped bleeding, and soon suddenly diminished and is now well. Aeneas went back to fight and convened with his commanders because he had a strategy to alter the direction of the conflict. Aeneas divided his troops, with one group opposing Turin's army while the others would attack the Latin city, which was essentially undefended by the Trojans. Effortlessly climbed the walls with very no resistance from the remaining soldiers to defend the city. The remaining men couldn't compete with the seasoned combatants who had established themselves on the Trojan walls. The Trojans captured the ramparts and then unlocked the gates for the remainder of the troops to enter the city. Turnus turned around and saw that Aeneas's cunning had tricked him. Seeing the columns of smoke rising from the structures beyond the walls, when the queen saw the attackers approaching her palace, she got desperate and, overcome with remorse, since she felt that she no longer deserved to live and bear the suffering of her country after causing its destruction. Fellow citizens, the Trojan-Latin conflict was on the verge of collapse. The Latin wall had been breached by the Trojans and their allies. The soldiers were making a valiant effort to keep their city from being captured, but it appeared that there was going to be a massive slaughter similar to the one at Troy. That Turnus demanded an end to all fighting because he was there to fight Aeneas once, declared that the gods would now disclose their will and hand, negating the need for more Latin or Trojan blood to be shed. Turnus, who had won, took his sword from his chariot driver and went to confront Aeneas. The fate of the Italian peninsula rested on the shoulders of these two warriors, who were scarred by innumerable battles. Aeneas, son of Venus, the Trojan hero, carried on his back not only the dreams of his. Turnus, the strong leader of the Retelling, stood before him, bearing not only the weight of people, but also the weight of a divinely foreseen fate, represented the pride and intense desire that drove the Italic resistance to assert his claim to the throne. Aeneas had faced Achilles and other elite Greek fighters, and he believed that the Turnus was comparable to the best Achaean warriors in terms of strength and resourcefulness, surged forward with unbridled rage, making Aeneas stay defensive. Turnus then struck Aeneas in the chest with a forceful blow. Turnus was defenseless because he was shielded by the god Vulcan's divine armor, which was so strong that it caused T's sword to shatter. Then, vulnerable to Aeneas' spear, Aeneas threw it, but Turnus, with incredible reflexes, allowed a Latin warrior to dodge the lethal missile just in time, attempted to pass Turnus' sword, but was thwarted by Aeneas' icy blade, which threatened to sever his neck. Once more, the nymph sister intervened by giving her brother her father's divine sword, so he might soak it in. Venus saw that yet again, and she snapped the blade in the foreign invader's blood. Another instance of divine intervention had occurred, defying Jupiter's own decree, which had mandated that the gods would no longer interfere with the war's outcome. Jupiter stated in a firm voice that if he persisted in interfering, the war would go on forever, and he was already weary of it all. But Juno was positive that Turnus would die before the end of time unless her celestial allies intervened. Trojan hero, the goddess who detested the Trojan tradition's successor, created one. She made her strong husband's final request, asking him to prevent Aeneas from naming the site New Troy and avoid allowing Trojan culture to control Latin traditions. Jupiter persuaded his bride that mankind had always been so obedient to the gods, believed the Latin language will not only endure, but also proliferate globally as the individuals coming out of because Trojan and Italic union would be so powerful, anyone who attempted to oppose them would be defeated. Turnus seemed to be losing, but supernatural intervention and Aeneas's tenacious fight began to turn the tide in his favor. His hold, due to fatigue, taking advantage of Turnus' vulnerability. Aeneas struck him with a tremendous strike. Turnus suffered serious injuries and lost, according to Aeneas' triumph, placing his foot over his opponent's chest and preparing to execute the Cupigra when Turnus began. Aeneas, who had fought in combat for the majority of his life, was pleading for his life, compassion, because he was sick of shedding the blood of his adversary. But when he saw, his ire was aroused when he saw that Turnus was sporting Prince Pallas's belt as a prize. Any compassion vanished as the Trojan prince killed his adversary. The Trojans discovered a new home after Aeneas defeated Turnus. As the gods had foretold, Aeneas married Lavinia, a Latin woman in Italy. Aeneas became king after forging an unbreakable alliance between the two peoples, prince of the Latium region, and his kingdom was renowned for its justice and wisdom. Aeneas would follow in his father's footsteps and become a strong, moral man, will later establish Alba Longa, the mother city of future Rome. He was well known among his people, for the Julian dynasty was named after Ollys. Famous Roman historical personalities would come from the Julian ancestry, including Emperor Octavian Augustus and Julius Caesar, who led the Roman individuals to their everlasting splendor. Hey,